The Silent Hill 2 remake is here and takes you back to 2001 to follow James Sunderland through his dark journey through the foggy town of Silent Hill. The game is available on Steam and PlayStation 5 at the moment. Atmosphere. You walk the empty streets of Silent Hill like you're floating up from a dream. The town is abandoned, the place is dirty and unused. There are tufts of grass growing from cracks in the road. Nobody's been here for a long time, and the fog seeping in makes what lies ahead uncertain. The game uses the original game's soundtrack very little, but when it does, the dread comes creeping back in rapidly. You shut the door and the daylight gets left outside. Dark, compacted rooms are filled with broken furniture and lost memories, left to rot like the water stains on the walls. But then it gets even worse as the world seems to waste away further, rusty pipes and decaying plaster, a nightmare made exquisitely for you. The game's atmosphere comes and goes, with certain moments being filled with this unreal tension as you wait for the sounds of the creatures you've heard to come out the walls and get you, but also moments of nothing amidst the feelings. The sound design plays into the atmosphere heavily, with an immaculate immersion that never lets you forget where you are, trapped inside this tormented world, and because of it and the game's themes, a sadness washes over the game. The music is more somber, talking to characters leaves you feeling a sense of sympathy or yet more revulsion, a fear of not understanding. Maria is softer, more gentle and supportive, coaxing you into a false sense of security. The incredible detail in the environments makes the places you walk through have a dark character to them, and the nightmare goes on and on. Things make less sense, and there's something lurking on the horizon that's been waiting inside. The atmosphere has changed. Sometimes it lets you stew, and sometimes it leaves you alone, but it's always watching. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's enemies do a great job of being repulsive, with the lying figures having an unnatural slickness to them, and hitting them with your weapons feels like smacking a wet bag of flesh. The general weirdness of the game shines through sometimes, with the sound of people crying from behind closed doors and the sound of birds flapping their wings in a room full of empty cages. When the game goes quiet, the sound design will instead fill your ears with the sound of something moving in seemingly an empty room with no sign of where it came from. Maybe you're imagining things, maybe it's an old building, maybe there's something there. In contrast to the original, the game's scares come mostly from the combat. The boss fights were extremely intimidating and generally quite frightening and frantic with how little supplies I seem to enter the boss areas with, on top of the combat's natural challenge. And the combat can be pretty challenging, with some aggressive enemies that use a varying degree of moves to attack James, from spurting acid upon defeat to attempting to hide in rooms to attack him. The hiding was sometimes executed really well, which led to a surprise hit in the back, but sometimes laughably bad, with mannequins leaning up against a wall in a brightly lit room trying to hide. The combat does have some problems that could degrade the experience, with the game's general darkness, the narrow cone of the flashlight, the red filter around the screen when you take damage, enemies being evasive and being able to spurt acid onto your screen, all made it harder to see what you were trying to hit, leading me to deactivating the red filter to try and help. Despite doing as much searching as I could, I also found gathering supplies to be rather challenging, which increased the amount of stress when combat inevitably started, leading to a familiar sinking feeling. But the game's combat is a huge part of the game and was very difficult to avoid. Enemies follow you into other rooms and there's no pausing the game to check the map if you're lost. By the halfway point it was getting tiring fighting things, and if it wasn't for the new techniques the enemies used as the games progressed, it would be hard to say that the combat is frightening as opposed to tedious. The game's level design also had some problems with predictability, with nearly every time you see a dead enemy you didn't kill, it's guaranteed that it and every other enemy will get up once you claim the area's key item, like clockwork. This and certain things were a little overused, like James shoving his hand through the hole in the wall, testing your will to push the button again to lean your hand in further in fear of something grabbing you. This was really nerve-wracking the first time, but by the fifth time nothing had ever grabbed James and it was a bit disappointing. The horror is derived mostly from the game's combat and implications in its sound design. It's intense, brutal, and can be unforgiving. Its enemies are spiteful and push you to be the same. Searching for supplies is hard, and struggling against things that are here to torment you has been made into a real fight for survival. Thematically, it's fitting. That's two Harry Masons. Sound design. The soundtrack uses specific pieces from the original game to great effect in some areas, creating dread and uncertainty when they're played, like your mind is being slowly eroded. And whilst the new additions add a softer, more emotive tone, it does feel like they underutilized the original game's frankly incredible soundtrack, with some astoundingly eerie songs just not returning to the game. The soundtrack at large was still satisfactory, and some of the new pieces did add more to cutscenes in certain scenarios. Specific moments like Angela's scene on the stairs could have gone either way with the original soundtrack or the new piece, which both worked well when played back to back.
Don't pity me. I'm not worth it.
However, the real champion of the game's sound design was the constant sound effects and ambiance of the areas, like the scratchy radio and the enemies gurgling and jittering, the bug-like scritching of insects as they swarm in certain rooms. Some sound effects were utterly disgusting, and things like the impact sounds of the melee weapons sounded as realistic as the act of hitting the enemies looked. The menu sounds aren't quite as iconic as the original game, but still have that haunting feel. The voice acting was very, very good, with only a few moments where it felt like it would have been better if James just hadn't said anything at all.
Hey, wait.
But for the large majority of the game, the characters, Angela's especially, conveyed their intense feelings through their confused stutters and pained tones without you even needing to hear what they're saying. The voice acting has painted a lot of characters in a different light by the way that they talk and react to things.
You're,
James.
back at the apartment building.
Yeah, I remember.
James's frantic screams as he fights enemies, smashing them into the ground and grunting again, sounds as desperate as it looks, and it's satisfying to so thoroughly defeat your foes. The directional audio and reverb worked incredibly well throughout the game to keep you turning your head in certain directions, like the infamous horse galloping sound that's in the prison's yard kept me turning the camera to see it, but there was nothing there. Overall, the sound design was extremely good, even if it seemed to hold itself back on certain things. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. There's some minor bloodstains, messages written in blood, and James's coat goes the way of Silent Hill Downpour. When he takes damage, blood smears over his back that's magically healed when he drinks a health drink. Enemies don't spurt blood, but turn slowly red when you defeat them, and that's about it for the game's gore. There's very little in the game's long runtime, which did feel a little lacking, but it's still appropriate considering the psychological horror theme. That's 4 Harry Masons.
James? Honey? Did something happen to you? After we got separated in that long hallway? Are you confusing me with someone else? You were always so forgetful. Remember that time in the hotel?
Maria?
You said you took everything. But you forgot that videotape we made.
Story. James Sunderland arrives in the foggy town of Silent Hill by the request of a letter he receives that seems to be from his deceased wife. He states at the start he doesn't know why he's here, when he knows that Mary has passed away, but he's here anyway. What follows is still one of the best psychological horror stories ever conceived, with James's dark journey encompassing several other characters along the way. There have been some quite noticeable changes in characters' demeanours, from some seeming more obviously violent and others inclined to win you over, but the additional scenes the game gives you go a long way to fleshing out certain characters' histories that were previously left ambiguous. All the major plot points are very similar to the original, which is high praise, though there were some moments that were a little less impactful due to small design choices. There's a lot more diary entries in the game, and some of them are still very eerie to read from the original, but some of the newer ones leave very little impact or explain things that didn't really seem to add anything or felt more heavy-handed in their symbolism. The symbolism itself was always a big part of the game, and it's still doing an incredible job with things like the environmental storytelling, which is way better at explaining subtle things about what happened long before you got here, and the kind of emotions preying on James's mind. The story very much still hits the mark, and the cutscenes were some of the game's highlights. Making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. Silent Hill 2's remake was far better than I was anticipating, but for me at least, it doesn't quite meet the original. It does some things better, but for me personally, not the things that I enjoyed the most about the original game. It feels to me more like a survival horror game than the original did, and to be brutally honest, I didn't really like playing the remake very much at all. Maybe at some point I'll be talking about my personal thoughts on the game, but for now, that was the review. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that I didn't scream like a banshee or run on the computer, and advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.